Good morning, my name is Ed. I was fortunate enough to win the BASES Masters Dissertation of the Year award, so I was asked to present my work on carbohydrate nutrition and acute recovery of endurance exercise capacity. Unfortunately, both Air New Zealand and British Airways conspired against me, so I've had to do a quick recording from my postgrad office instead. If you have any questions about the presentation, please don't hesitate to send me an email. Before I tell you about what we did, I'm going to try and offer a little background into why carbohydrate nutrition interventions have implications for acute recovery of endurance exercise performance. So we as humans have quite limited capacity to store carbohydrate energy as glycogen, with less than 3,000 kilocalories in our skeletal muscle and liver. Importantly, carbohydrate is a critical energy source during prolonged exercise, and exercise of sufficient length and intensity will deplete our glycogen stores to very low concentrations. Indeed, this figure shows data that I've recreated from one of the pioneering studies from the 1960s, and that demonstrated an 87% decline in muscle glycogen content at fatigue following exhaustive cycling. It is now thought that depletion of glycogen stores to these low concentrations may impair the fundamentals of muscle contraction, and that this may be the mechanistic cause of the hitting the wall or bonking phenomenon familiar to many endurance athletes and a cause of fatigue during prolonged exercise. Endurance athletes often perform multiple training sessions in a single day, or even compete in endurance events with limited recovery durations, such as Grand Tour cycling races or multi-day ultra-distance running competitions. Previous work from James Betts' group in Bath showed that repeated endurance running capacity is also limited by muscle glycogen availability, and so carbohydrate ingestion during acute recovery from endurance exercise is therefore important for maximising subsequent work outputs. Interestingly, previous research has demonstrated that when combined carbohydrate sources are ingested in the acute period following exercise, that being glucose and fructose together rather than isochloric glucose on its own, increases the storage of glycogen in the liver alongside equal storage in the muscle. If liver glycogen availability is also important for repeated exercise capacity, it might be expected that ingestion of carbohydrates from combined sources is favourable in this context. So, the aim of our study was to investigate if ingestion of combined carbohydrate sources during acute recovery from prolonged exercise increases subsequent exercise capacity and how this might manifest metabolically. To do this, we compared maltodextrin and fructose ingestion against maltodextrin and glucose ingestion. Given that maltodextrin simply consists of many linked glucose molecules and is metabolized almost identically to glucose, it is worth noting that the maltodextrin-fructose condition in the present study is the combined carbohydrate trial, whereas maltodextrin glucose is the single carbohydrate trial. We postulated that maltodextrin-fructose co-ingestion would augment the recovery of endurance capacity, and that this would be attributable to greater carbohydrate storage and therefore availability for oxidation during the second bout of exercise. To do this, we conducted a single-blind, randomised, counterbalanced crossover study with 8 endurance-trained runners and 4 laboratory visits. So they first came in for a screening or a VO2 max test, they then did a full familiarisation, and they did the 2 experimental trials, so i.e. a maltodextrin and glucose trial and a maltodextrin and fructose trial. This is what our experimental trial protocol looked like. The participant arrived first thing in the morning after an overnight fast, having completed a 72-hour weighed diet and physical activity record to be replicated in advance of the subsequent experimental trial. I cannulated them on arrival for repeat blood sampling throughout the day, and they then commenced treadmill running at 70% of their VO2 max all the way to exhaustion. Expired gases and scales for gastrointestinal comfort were collected throughout. We utilised the 3-strike volitional exhaustion rule, whereby on attainment of exhaustion, the treadmill speed was slowed to a walk for 2 minutes and then increased back to the run speed, such that the protocol was only terminated upon the 3rd attainment of volitional exhaustion. So while this is perhaps cruel, this procedure has been shown to reduce the coefficient of variation for exercise capacity, and the CV for bout 1 in our study was only 5.5%, so that was pretty good. A 4-hour recovery period then followed, during which participants consumed 90 grams per hour of maltodextrin and either glucose or fructose in a 1.5 to 1 ratio. These were consumed as beverages at half-hourly intervals, after which a second bout of treadmill running to exhaustion was conducted. The carbohydrates ingested during the recovery period were naturally enriched with 13 molecular weight carbon atoms, meaning that we could use mass spectrometry to estimate the rate at which those high 13C carbohydrates ingested during the recovery period were oxidized during the second bout of treadmill running. Statistically, we used a pretty traditional approach and added some Cohen's d effect sizes and 90% confidence limits and percent changes where appropriate. So, to my results, the main outcome of my study was exercise capacity in bout 2, which is displayed graphically here. The grey bar shows how bout 2 exercise capacity was significantly longer in the fructose trial, and the lines show that this effect was consistent in 7 of the 8 individual participants. The magnitude of this difference was large and amounted to, on average, 33% extension of exercise capacity with the fructose trial. In terms of the underlying physiology, rates of whole body carbohydrate oxidation were not significantly different during bout 2 between trials at either 15 minutes, 30 minutes or at exhaustion, which of course came much later in the fructose trial. However, the total amount of carbohydrate oxidized during bout 2 was significantly higher in the fructose trial. It's not possible to determine if this greater total carbohydrate combustion during the fructose trial was attributable to greater carbohydrate availability that sustained carbohydrate oxidation rates for longer, or if this was simply an effect of the extended exercise capacity attributable to some other mechanism. We could only compare rates of carbohydrate oxidation at these 3 time points, as these are the only ones for which we have values in all 8 participants. My feeling from analysing the responses of individual participants is that carbohydrate oxidation rates were sustained for much longer in the fructose trial before plummeting to the same unsustainable rates at exhaustion. This is what is shown on this figure, with the rate of carbohydrate oxidation in the fructose trial in an individual participant clearly sustained for longer before declining to the same low rate at exhaustion as in the glucose trial. So, to try and delve more deeply into this, I modelled carbohydrate oxidation rate curves in the fructose trial of the 7 participants who exhibited enhanced exercise capacity in this condition, such that I had a model estimated rate of carbohydrate oxidation in the fructose trial at the exact time point at which fatigue occurred in the glucose trial. This modelled rate was significantly greater than the rate at exhaustion in the glucose trial, which, to me at least, provides some support for the suggestion that in the fructose trial, exercise capacity was extended secondary to an improved ability to sustain the rate of carbohydrate oxidation required to fuel the exercise intensity. In further support of this, the rate of oxidation of the specific high 13C carbohydrates ingested during the recovery period during bout 2 was significantly elevated at 15 and 30 minutes of exercise, and a greater total oxidation of ingested carbohydrate was seen during the fructose trial. In terms of the plasma variables, glucose and non-esterified fatty acids were not significantly different between trials, but as shown here, plasma lactate concentrations were elevated during recovery in the fructose trial. This was what we had anticipated and likely reflects hepatic conversion of ingested fructose into lactate for release into the circulation and possible uptake into skeletal muscle. Self-report measures of gastrointestinal comfort were not significantly different between trials at any specific time point. However, it does look as though there was a trend towards slightly elevated nausea during bout 2 in the glucose trial. I personally don't feel that this tendency was of sufficient magnitude to limit exercise capacity, but we couldn't rule this out completely. So, the main finding of our study was therefore that short-term recovery of endurance exercise capacity was significantly enhanced with maltodextrin-fructose co-ingestion during a 4-hour recovery period compared to the same number of calories from maltodextrin and glucose. As I outlined, I think the data we collected suggests that this effect was attributable to increased carbohydrate storage and availability for oxidation. However, we cannot rule out the possibility of a minor effect of gastrointestinal comfort. From a more practical standpoint, the ingestion of carbohydrate from combined sources during an acute recovery period, i.e. from a glucose-based and a fructose-based source simultaneously, might be favourable for endurance athletes seeking to build big training volumes through 2 or 3 a day training sessions, or in those athletes who participate in multi-day challenging events like Grand Tour cycling races or something like the Marathon des Sables. This nutrition could be achieved through things like fruit smoothies in favour of starchy pasta meals in the real world, as opposed to the high 13C sugar water we used in the lab. It also indirectly supports the assertion that practitioners should consider interventions that maximise liver glycogen content in order to optimise endurance performance. Lastly, then, I'd like to acknowledge my supervisor, or then supervisor, Dr. Gareth Wallis, who many of you will know is the man when it comes to carbohydrate nutrition and metabolism for endurance sport. I'd also like to thank the participants who underwent what was a very grueling protocol and basis for the award. The study was published in MedSci, so please feel free to check it out or get in touch if you wish, clearly via email. Thanks.